Welcome to Gramerica, a new podcast series following the high-stakes Senate campaign of Graham Platner. A Maine oyster farmer and Marine veteran, Platner is attempting the improbable, unseating five-term Republican Senator Susan Collins. It's a race garnering national attention, and for good reason. After Governor Janet Mills's shock exit just weeks before the primary, the path is cleared for Platner. It's now a one-on-one fight in which, barring any more major surprises, a populist newcomer could help the Democrats win the 4 seats they need to reclaim the Senate. If Susan Collins is defeated, it won't just be a local upset. It could shift the entire balance of power in the Senate and redefine the party's direction for a generation. By shattering the old rules of electability, in other words, calling bullshit on seniority, experience, and the quest for centrist alignment, Platner is doing more than running a campaign. He's rewriting the national playbook. If he wins, the map changes for everyone.
The stakes of this race haven't escaped anyone. Not Maine voters, not the GOP, and certainly not the Democratic establishment. Platner's generating a level of enthusiasm Maine hasn't seen in decades, fueled by an insurgent outsider challenge to the status quo. He's capitalizing on deep-seated economic and political discontent, one directed not just at the Trump administration and the Republican Party, but at the oligarchy, the gerontocracy, and the Epstein class.
Platner was virtually unknown until he burst onto the scene last summer. But after a supercharged start, fueled by a viral campaign video and standing room-only town halls, his momentum hit a wall. It was stalled by the emergence of a slew of incendiary revelations. First, a trail of Reddit posts written between 2009 and 2021, where he disparaged rural voters and made widely condemned remarks about victims of military sexual assault. Then came the most visual blow, the discovery of a skull and crossbones chest tattoo that many said bore resemblance to a totenkopf worn by the Nazi SS. Though Platner claimed he'd had it inked as a young Marine in 2007 without knowing its meaning, the damage was done. Yet Platner has managed to weather the scandals and defy conventional political wisdom. And after outlasting Governor Mills, who trailed him by more than 30 points in several polls, he is now considered highly competitive against Susan Collins in the upcoming Senate contest.
Gramerica will explore how Platner fought his way to the front of the pack and take you on the campaign trail from here through to the election in November. In doing so, we'll dive into a dizzying array of themes that this race has unearthed. Can the political newcomer realistically dismantle the status quo? Can Democrats reclaim their identity as the party of the working class? Can a candidate's transgressions be forgiven? Or are Democrats held to an impossible moral standard? Are voters truly ready to dispense with politics as usual? Can a battle-hardened Marine steal the country away from its forever wars? Will punk rock, earrings and tattoos become the new hallmarks of the Senate campaigns nationwide? I'm Adrian Cole.
And I'm Pip Wood. As our listeners in Maine can surely tell, both of us are from away. But we both have significant roots in the state and have called Maine home for years. We're also avid consumers and producers of news. While this series reflects our personal perspectives on the campaign, we don't for a second claim it to be a definitive or expert account. We believe Graham Platner's campaign is highly unusual, both in style and substance, and that it has the potential to rewrite the political playbook in Maine and beyond. So stay with us for our journey into Gramerica.
That roar you're hearing, it isn't for the band, it's for the man currently launching himself off of the stage and into a sea of hands.
You're listening to the sound of Graham Platner crowd surfing at a sold-out Dropkick Murphys show in Portland. In a state known for quiet town halls and polite parades, Platner is doing something very different. He's turning a mosh pit into a campaign stop.
This is just the latest headline-grabbing moment from a campaign that's defying 30 years of political gravity. From outside of Maine, it's hard to grasp the sheer scale of this phenomenon. How, in a few short months, the total unknown has catapulted himself to the center of an epochal Senate race, upending the natural order of the state's traditionally staid political culture. Between his blunt delivery and his polarizing history, Graham Platner has upended the traditional Maine apple cart. The veteran of 4 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan has become a political lightning rod, forcing every Democrat to pick a side. To some, he's the long-awaited prophet of the working class. To others, a dangerous, unhinged radical. Here are the sounds of that divide.
It's not so much that the guy is absolutely a homophobe, absolutely a transphobe. It's more that he's an asshole.
He's a grown man who's not a pussy. And his entire political philosophy is not based on being anti-Trump.
He's playing upper middle class dude games. That's the game he is playing.
Some leftists are just writing this off as a normal guy running for office with skeletons in his closet. But I don't really buy that because I've seen other Democrats get written off for way less.
I mean, he was literally protesting George Bush and signing up to go to war at the same time. I'm not trying to make a claim about him. I genuinely don't know what to do with that.
The boldest anti-racist white people I've ever met have been covered in blackout ink.
This man has made a long career out of following orders from empire. You think he's going to jump in and break the system for you? His are the boots that the system will place on your neck.
I don't know him personally, but I sure as hell know and have sought out people who do, because 2 degrees of separation is all you get if you're from Maine. His people say he is exactly who he says he is, and that can't be faked here. He's speaking in a way that resonates with my neighbors and resonates with me.
Since launching his Senate run in August, Graham Platner's campaign hasn't just grown, it's caught fire. He isn't merely running for a seat, he's running to dismantle what he calls a broken political paradigm. As Platner himself put it,
There is also an anti-establishment angst occurring that really is the core of what most people, Republican, Democrat, or Independent, are feeling right now. People are angry with the system, and they should be. It is a system that does not represent them, and they know it. And we very much need to engage in a project that is not just about winning the Senate seat, but is about building power again, working class power in the state of Maine.
the 41-year-old oyster farmer from the down east town of Sullivan has been packing town halls, releasing viral videos that get millions of views, and winning endorsements from political heavyweights like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Ro Khanna, and the powerful UAW. Spearheading a campaign as a working-class outsider, Platner focuses on material freedoms, housing affordability, universal health care, what he calls an end to stupid foreign wars, and the dismantling of the billionaire economy.
It feels like he's been everywhere all at once, manning picket lines, leading protests against ICE and the Iran war, and even publicly announcing a trip to Norway for IVF treatment with his wife, Amy. His trademark language, blunt, plain-spoken, and gruff, sounds like it comes from boatyards and construction sites. It's authentic Maine grit weaponized for national politics.
Been very open about being a disabled veteran. What's your response if Republicans criticize you for that?
Fuck off.
As Platner barnstorms the state with a blunt working-class populist message, the Republican establishment is panicking. GOP super PACs have already pledged more than $60 million to defend Collins, a massive escalation over her 2020 race, and we're still 6 months out from Election Day. But it isn't just Republicans pressing the panic button.
The Democratic establishment in D.C. was wary of Platner from the get-go, fearing slogans like "Fight the Oligarchy" would alienate suburban moderates. Unable to control or predict him, the party threw its full weight behind Governor Mills, who had been a fixture of Maine politics for decades. Mills ran as the steady hand, a contrast to the perceived chaos of the Platner campaign, but despite her experience and the party's backing, she was unable to match the enthusiasm of the Platner movement. Her campaign came to an end in late April, making Platner the de facto nominee. To get some perspective on Mills' surprise suspension of her campaign and what it means for Maine's unusually colourful Senate race, we sat down with Amy Freed, Professor Emerita of Political Science at the University of Maine. Professor Freed was previously the John Mitchell Nickerson Professor at UMaine and is a leading voice on the history of political polarization. Her most recent scholarly book, At War with Government: How Conservatives Weaponized Distrust from Goldwater to Trump, was co-authored with Douglas B. Harris and published by Columbia University Press.
Why do you think Mills pulled out, and why now?
Well, I will take the governor at her word, which is that she really was having trouble raising money. And what starts to happen with a campaign is it's not doing well in the polls, start having trouble raising money, and then that creates more and more of a cycle. So it gets harder and harder to run more ads. It gets harder and harder to just really keep going. And yeah, certainly her campaign had some real problems. Earlier polls had her behind Platner, but then she dropped quite a bit over time. She just found herself in just a really bad feedback loop.
Was she running a poor campaign, or was Platner running an amazing campaign, or a combination of both?
I think Mills made a mistake in not declaring early. Waiting so long to declare, rather, because by the time she declared, Platner was in. He had really built up a fair amount of momentum and created a lot of excitement. She waited a long time. I think she thought she could just sort of come in almost like an incumbent in the seat and, take her time. And that was kind of a mistake. Then she ran really what was a very traditional campaign in Maine. You don't see the sorts of things that Platner is doing typically even in a statewide run with lots and lots of big events. So she kind of stuck to the tried and true smaller events, either in people's homes or other kinds of, tight audiences. And that just wasn't going to work this time. People wanted to see someone. They wanted to be able to talk to them. Also, over the course of her governorship, even though I think she did some things that even Platner supporters would see as very positive and progressive, she didn't do really coalition management. In other words, she took positions that if she knew she was going to run for election, statewide office again, she might have been more careful in how she did them. And it kind of turned off a lot of voters.
How does the timing of the Mills announcement land? Is it good for Platner, or could Platner have used Mills in the campaign for longer? Likewise, would the GOP have liked to see the circular firing squad go on for a bit longer?
I think in some ways, both Platner and Republicans were already turning to the general election. So this just kind of pushes it a little faster. Republicans or Republican allied groups are already running anti-Platner ads. And I think that Platner has been talking more about Collins than about Mills for a bit. There are, two other people in the race. It's possible some people will vote for one of them as a protest vote. They don't like Platner. Although Mills will be on the ballot, they could still vote for her if they want. But I think he's got a glide path to the nomination.
Just looking ahead, let's assume that all the Democrats get on board and support Platner. What else is he going to need to do in order to win this? I mean, he's going to need to win over independents. Is he going to need to win over some disaffected Trump voters? And if so, how does he move the needle?
Well, I think he could perhaps move some disaffected Trump voters with his critique of the war, because there are certainly some of them who oppose, quite strongly involvement in a foreign war. Of course, that depends how long everything goes on. Mm-hmm. And they may be unhappy with just the economic impacts of the war as well. But in Maine, I think generally he has to win a lot of unenrolled voters. That's the biggest group of voters in Maine, are people who don't identify with either political party. They're always varied. They're not always one thing, I mean, really the way that Collins has won before is that she picks off older female voters. Often those voters are, don't have college degrees. They might be working class women. I mean, it's not the only folks that she gets, but that's that is an important part of her winning coalition. And, maybe I don't know how those voters see Platner. One other thing, though, I would mention is that, it's not the same voters that existed 6 years ago. I mean, some of the older voters aren't voting anymore. They've either passed away or they're not, they're not healthy and they're not going to be engaged. Plus, so there's the younger voters who really were the voters that didn't support the ones who were voting 6 years ago. So now they're in their early mid-20s. Were not pro-Collins at all.
Right.
So there's them. Then there's young, even the new voters. Plus there are a fair number of people who moved to Maine during and right after the pandemic. Maine has had a fair amount of in-migration, and my understanding is that those voters tend to be fairly left. Right. So, if you're talking about even 10,000 voters, new voters, or 20,000 that you can pick up, that can matter.
I've heard recently the idea from a fairly mainstream Democrat, the idea that it's just too hard to believe he didn't know that tattoo was a Totenkopf, was a Nazi tattoo. Therefore, he isn't getting that person's vote. There are Democrats who were appalled by the Reddit posts and the tattoo. Where do you think they're going to go from here? I mean, I think personally, if they listen to a few more podcasts and they really drill down, they would find that maybe there wasn't any there, or his explanations are acceptable, or something along those lines. But a lot of people seem to have accepted his explanations and moved on to the platform. What do you think about that?
I think most Mills supporters will ultimately back Platner. Some won't, whether it's because of the tattoos or the Reddit posts. I talked to someone recently who said they know a number of sexual assault survivors who don't feel comfortable supporting him. But, as the fall election gets closer and closer, it will be further clarified what the choice is. Now, you could always have some people who don't vote for anybody at all. They stay home.
Right.
And that could end up happening with some voters. But I think, there's a lot more to play out in this campaign. I have never trusted actually very much the polls that showed him having, bigger leads over Susan Collins and Janet Mills did. I think that played a role somewhat in what happened with Mills and her not being able to attract funds and, ultimately the spiral down. But he really hadn't had a serious test in terms of the kind of pummeling that everybody knows is coming his way and the Republicans are starting to do. And he may very well be able to withstand that. It's probably too many times of me seeing Susan Collins escape when it looked like she was going to get beaten that, you can't count on anything until the votes are counted.
Well, it seems that, when it comes to the Reddit posts and the tattoos, I mean, those are his obviously the major vulnerabilities. It seems like when Mills attacked him, launched the attack ads, conventional wisdom is that backfired. In a one-on-one with Collins, what are they going to be coming at him with? Is there anything more, you think, than the tattoo and the Reddit posts?
I think it's a very different thing when an attack is coming from within your own party, and then that did backfire. So it seems. But when you're talking about appealing to independent, or what in Maine are called unenrolled voters, and getting all your Republicans out, that's a different sort of thing. So I think it could be more effective in that context. And besides those sorts of things, I do think we're going to see other things. Some will be, sort of like straight policy differences. Some might be based on his inexperience in governing. There was an ad that just came out today from the National Republicans where I really think the emphasis there was in saying that he was inauthentic.
Right.
That,
exactly.
He says he's working class, but look, his grandfather was this architect and he went to this prep school, all that kind of stuff. And really what that ends up being is an attack, making the case that he's a risky person.
Right.
You don't know who he really is. He's pretending to be one thing. He's really somebody else. So even if you tend to like him in some ways, he isn't really who he says he is, or you can't count on being who he is, who he really says he is. That is going to be a really, really strong frame in Republican attacks.
We need to kind of clarify what anyone means by working class these days, because he said himself that it really just means wage earner.
But he could really contend he comes from a working class background, but maybe as a result of being in the military for a long time, and then the kind of work that he's doing.
That's right. He's working in a blue collar environment.
Right. But it is something that I think Republicans are going to push him on. And even being an oyster farmer, he's not really like a typical like lobsterman who's getting up at 4:00 in the morning, going out on the boat and fixing his engine when it breaks and
plowing in the winter.
That. Yeah, it's not. He's not really in that same category. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think they're going to push him on that. And then negative campaigning has always been a really major part of every college campaign. I think a lot of people looking at her campaigns don't realize the extent to which she and her allies go hard negative on opponents. And then she's going to try to drift above it all and be the person who's, the nice Susan Collins who helps get a grant for the local fire station and, brings home the bacon and all of that. So I think she's not herself probably going to attack him very much. She'll just sort of smile and say she has concerns about him or something. But her party and the super PACs are going to go really hard against him. I've heard some people suggest that the Trump administration particularly would get, they'd release Platner's military service record, and maybe there's something in that. I wouldn't put it past them.
Are you thinking about a sort of swift boating situation?
Well, and definitely a swift boating sort of situation, I think, is very possible, where you find people who served with him and then they say certain negative things about him. That's the usual approach there. Even if most of the people he served with think he's a great guy, and there's probably somebody who doesn't.
Maybe just for listeners, swift boating, referring to John Kerry's campaign, where he was on a gunboat in Vietnam and some of his buddies dug up dirt and basically sort of muddied his otherwise very impressive veteran background.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is something that Graham Platner really has had front and center. His military career is massively important in his mythology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's the complication with that I've heard some people talk about, where he'll say, Susan Collins sent me to Iraq, but the complication is he himself decided to go.
Right.
And that was after he had opposed the war. So it's a little muddled there. But then, does she or her allies want to spend their time and resources focusing on that? That might not be what they want to emphasize. And I think it is always tricky to go after someone for their military service in any way.
What are Platner's main lines of attack going to be going ahead?
Well, I think his main line of attack has been this very class-based sort of thing about the oligarchy and billionaires. And then everything kind of gets wrapped up in that, whether it has to do with war, healthcare, housing, anything. I think he should maybe talk about other things, not always in terms of that. I don't know. I think that's where people will ask him questions about constitutional rights, and that's a little harder to deal with. I mean, in terms of his overall theme. And sometimes what he'll say is, people are bringing up anti-trans policies because they want to distract you from what is the real issue, which is the power of the oligarchs and billionaires. I mean, that might be a reasonable way to talk about it, but you can talk about those things in and of themselves, that people actually deserve basic rights. Like
right.
You could talk about, you could talk about reproductive rights. You could talk about freedom. You could, it's not everything has to get tied into that overall thematic.
He may describe it as being a distraction, but he is nonetheless at some point going to have to take a position on these things that he says are being used to distract people, like LGBT or trans bathrooms.
I think he has taken positions, but just the way that he's talked about them is going back to talking about the class structure and
Right.
kind of the power of, the very wealthy people, instead of just talking about it in and of itself.
Right, which is something that Mills did quite effectively, and she scored many successes in that realm and in reproductive rights. And he's not really on the same level in that respect at the moment.
Well, he also, he doesn't have the same background in,
right,
working on those issues and passing policies. And I mean, I do have friends who are concerned about his general lack of experience. But last election, I always like to bring this up with the 2020 election, because it is true that she ended up she was like 9 points ahead of Sarah Gideon. But part of that was because there was Lisa Savage in the race, who was a kind of a green independent, who picked up a lot of votes. And Collins only got 51% of the vote. To me, that is really the key number, is the 51%, because it's a ranked choice race.
Right.
And so you can lose the race with under 50%, close to 50%, but under 50%. But of course, once you get over 50%, you're winning. So it really, so if she had gotten 49% after all, just 2 points less than what she got after all of the ranked choice tallies had taken place, she would have lost. My point is, looking at her margin, Collins's margin over Gideon, in some ways misrepresents how well she did.
You think about Platner doing 5 to 6 live events every day sometimes, and covering the entire state. It's really bringing it to the people and attracting a lot of attention. Whereas Susan Collins is, it's happening by phone, it's happening on TV, it's happening in small gatherings, entirely different. And in many ways, less sort of inspirational.
Yeah, what she would do in her last campaign, and she generally does, is she'd tell a few members of the press what she was doing, and she'd show up at some small town and have a little event in front of, let's say, their fire station, and say, Susan, here I am, and I helped you get a new fire truck. And then she'd get some good local press and state press out of it. But it wasn't big crowds or anything. So it went with her overall message about, I'm delivering help directly to you. But, there wasn't anything bigger. And really for a long time, I'd say since the start of the first Trump term, when groups like Individuals got really organized in Maine, there's been a big push to try to have Susan Collins do town halls. And
Right.
She never would. I mean, I think that same thing hurt Janet Mills. When you have an activist groups who have been calling for transparency and town halls and show up and answer our questions, and the governor doesn't do it while her her primary challenger does, then that's an issue for her. But it's also an issue for Collins that she never does. Plus, it just kind of is its own message. It's a message about age. It's a message about being somebody new. You're young, you're vibrant, you have lots of energy.
Can you speak a little bit about the Trump administration? Like, Collins is nominally connected to what's going on with Trump. How does she run a campaign, given that the Trump administration is like a roller coaster and nobody can really make sense of a lot of what is going on right now with Iran in particular, but obviously the gas prices economically? How do you position yourself if you're Collins and you're going into a long summer like this leading up to an election?
Collins is just going to try to run as herself, as her brand, that she's purportedly independent, which she's not, because she votes with Trump like 95% of the time, and that she's just homegrown Susan Collins. I'm going to put on some jeans and talk about Aroostook County and potatoes, and she's going to just try to be herself and her own brand and disconnect herself. And anybody who was going to run against her, whether it's Platner or if Mills had won the nomination, has to connect her back to Trump. It can't be the only thing they're doing, but I think that has to be part of the message. They have to have her, show the pictures of her in the Oval Office with Trump and talk about how much she votes with him. She's very wily in how she does things, though. This is all, I think, very known to a lot of Maine voters by now. For example, she's running an ad now where she says she's brought all this money to Maine's rural hospitals, and it's the biggest grants to Maine's rural hospitals there ever have been. Well, what she leaves out is that this is an amendment that she did manage to get passed to the One Big Beautiful Bill. But the amount that's going to Maine rural hospitals is 10% of the money that they're losing due to the passage of One Big Beautiful Bill. So, you know, she tries to create a credit claiming opportunity for something where overall Mainers are much worse off.
Right. She sided with the party that sort of gutted the funding for hospitals and then came back with a really mealy-mouthed amount and pretended to be fixing the problem. A bit like opening the Straits of Hormuz after closing them and claiming a victory.
Yeah, absolutely. And then even with the bill itself, she voted for the One Big Beautiful Bill to proceed, and then she voted against it. So she manages to be on like 3 different sides at the same time. I got the money in this amendment. I voted against the bill, but I voted for the bill to proceed. And like, how do you even like explain that to voters? It's like somehow you can't get caught in, even though these details are what explain it, you can't get caught in these details because nobody can really unravel it. It's like,
she's tying herself in
some
knots.
ball of string that's all, knotted up.
But do you think people are buying it?
I think a lot of people are not buying it. I think that's why she's back there, but she's been behind, or I looked at the polls from 6 years ago, and she's about 2 points behind where she was in terms of overall vote share. Like, she was getting 46% on average 6 years ago. She's now getting 44%, which she's not really, really far back on the one hand from where she was. There's enough people who have said, I'm not going to support her, that it could make the ultimate difference.
Trump really likes to say he's not on the ballot this time, so if there's a blue wave, it's not his fault. But obviously he is, and that's probably one of Collins's vulnerabilities, because she's siding with this guy who is just sort of tanking on so many levels. But there's also very specific real-time things that are happening. There was ICE, there's Iran, there's gas prices. This is all bundled with the Republican Party, right? So these have got to be front and center in her list of vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. I mean, there's always some impact on, the president's party in midterms. But she's, her thing has been that she's been able to separate herself from that and run on her own. But I'd also kind of wonder if there will be some Republicans who are upset with the direction of Trump, which she has been supporting him on the war. And, therefore, maybe they don't vote for Platner, but they don't vote. There's definitely a cohort of Republicans who are unhappy with the war. My understanding, not being an economist or anything, but just from what I read, is that all of the prices on, gas, heating oil, diesel are going to remain elevated for quite a long time. And Maine has the highest percentage of homes that are heated with heating oil. So it's a big expense for people.
We spoke earlier about her campaign against Sarah Gideon, and Sarah Gideon raised a lot more money, but was still beaten by Collins by about 10 points, I think, right? And Gideon came across as a Democrat from away, sort of wealthy, elite, coastal, southern, right? Collins now has a very different opponent. He's homegrown. If you want to see him as not centrist or elite, you can do, because he's working on the waterfront. Very much not Sarah Gideon. So she's not going up against the same centrist Democrat as 2020.
That's true, but she is going to try to Gideonize Platner in making him, as he's not who he says he is, right?
Right.
He is actually from an elite family. And I think those sorts of things just confuse people. I talked to a voter after the 2020 campaign who I know had been very critical of Collins, who told me he ended up voting for her. And I asked him why. And he said that he got so confused by all the negative ads, and that ultimately he decided, well, Susan Collins isn't perfect, but I know her, and she does really help Maine get all of these benefits.
Wow.
Now, we are, I think, in somewhat different times.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in 2020, she claimed that Roe wasn't going to be overturned. Well, it was, and the Supreme Court has been, just out of control from any standard of really trying to follow the Constitution. Mm-hmm. They're just so overtly political. And she's voted for a lot of his nominees, almost all of them.
One thing that I think could bear explaining a bit more about Platner's perspective in his campaign is his constant emphasis on building power and developing a movement. Sometimes that sounds a bit abstract, but you say he's got 15,000 volunteers. And you think back to the Organize for America of Obama and the idea that we're not just looking to move the needle in small incremental ways and alter policies and re-engineer a few things here and there to improve life for Mainers. He's taking on something much bigger project, which is really reinventing the economic system. It does seem to be something that resonates, but it's inspirational, isn't it, or aspirational? And to what extent is he going to have to ratchet back some of his rhetoric when he's actually in the Senate?
I have certainly thought about that. I think that it's going to be, he can't really be a full-time senator and a full-time organizer. And there are organizers and activist leaders who get elected. Certainly they'll stay in touch with that side of politics, but they have to focus on their day job, which is, being a House member or a senator. So I don't think he can really do that. But it is possible, I think, to keep some kind of organization going when he's in the Senate. Although that doesn't just run by itself. I mean, that still is going to take paying some staff members. It's going to take raising some money to keep it going.
Right.
And, a question will be what its relationship is to the Maine Democratic Party.
Right, which seemed to want Obama, for instance, to check his movement at the door of the White House.
Well, Obama did not follow through. He said he was going to try to keep Organizing for America going, and they just didn't do that. And some people think that was a big mistake because it stopped that kind of ongoing working in communities and organizing and talking to people at their doors. I don't think he himself can be leading that, especially since he's going to have a lot to learn.
And along those lines, I mean, there's a lot about his platform that is terribly inspiring and I think has galvanized a lot of people, but big, broad ideas, universal health care, kind of like, toppling the oligarchy. If he makes it into the Senate, how realistic are those goals?
Well, I do think some kind of universal health coverage is pretty popular among Democrats. But there's just not going to be the possibility to do anything while Trump is in there. And really, most change is incremental, which really requires knowing a lot of detail about health policies, like doing things little by little and bit by bit. But then there are also these big windows of opportunity when a lot can get done.
Right.
But there's not really going to be a window of opportunity to get a lot done in the next 2 years, which is why in some ways I do think, he's got time to learn about how things actually run and about the realities of what are the votes? What are the processes of the Senate? How many votes are there to do this or that?
Right.
How do you get people? How do you build coalitions? He'll have a lot to learn. I mean, I can sort of foresee at some point, some years from now, if he's elected, reading articles called The Education of Graham Platner.
Some of the story has to be about loss of innocence, a Mr. Smith goes to Washington type deal where, great aspirational goals come up against the cliff of reality. But there's nothing wrong, I guess, with a candidate saying, this is what I'm shooting for. And when I'm in a position of power, I'll be operating on that playbook. And I guess voters probably understand that you're never going to get everything you ask for, but you may as well ask for everything.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing is there are some voters who are very quick to turn against people and then decide that they're corrupt or even, traitors to the cause or whatever. I think some of Platner's supporters are like that. I have a sense he has more sense than that. Mario Cuomo, the former governor of New York, I think said you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose.
I know you don't like giving predictions, but how's this going to play out, do you think? What's your gut?
I can easily imagine what Collins and the Republicans are going to do in this campaign. And I can only imagine in part what the response is going to be. I don't think there's any doubt that the Collins campaign and her people are going to do this basically two-part kind of campaign of, I'm Susan Collins, I bring home the bacon, remember me, I'm a nice lady, and then just totally going nuclear on Graham Platner. There's no, that's what they're going to do. They're going to they're going to try to paint him as risky and authentic. Some of it will be sort of a soft kind of thing, like, isn't this funny? He says he's this, but he's really that. And some of it will be really scary looking ads where he's in black and white and flashes of red. And do you really know who Graham Platner is? That kind of thing.
Like Nazi colors, black, white, and red.
Oh, yeah. Just like he's just the scariest thing you can imagine. So that's definitely what Republicans are going to do. Mm-hmm. And then Platner, I think, is going to try to run the same campaign that he's had, where he talks about class and power and uses that frame and does a lot of town halls. I think he's certainly going to keep that up. Yeah. It's worked well for him. Tries to, keep his volunteers involved, keep them door knocking. But I'm not 100% sure how he's going to answer some of the criticisms and some of the attacks. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I don't think you can only say, they're trying to, take attention from what's the most important thing that's going on here. I think he should do more really local things besides the town halls, go and talk to people, at a health clinic that's having problems, keep staying open and do an event, a smaller scale
something
event
more
there.
like Collins does.
Something more like that. But, talk to the doctors, talk to the administrators, the nurses, patients. What does it mean to you, these cuts that have happened? Then you can use those people in ads too. So get a little bit more local, I think, would be helpful to him. Right. And have more of a strategy for answering Collins' attacks. Yeah. And don't make dumb mistakes, which may seem obvious, but, don't say anything that will become some kind of gaffe that they'll hit you on over and over.
Yeah. Maybe a few more fireside chats. Do you like those? The little rocking chair and the wood stove?
Some people seem to really like them.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a wild ride, you say?
I think it will be. I mean, I think given the context of the times and given, really the strength he has with volunteers, he definitely could win this race. But I never count out Susan Collins.
Right. It's a good place to wrap it up. We'll have to ask you back, and we'll be watching this space very carefully. And thank you, Amy, for all your time, all your insights. We're extremely grateful.
And your patience.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
To be continued.
Next time on Gramerica, we explore Platner's background and the formative experiences that brought him to this unlikely run for the Senate. Thanks for listening to the Two Broke Woke Blokes. If you like what you hear, please subscribe.